Hello and welcome to ORF Digital Conversations. As always, before I get to my guest of the day, a small note for our viewers. Please subscribe to ORF's channel on YouTube to get such curated content on your timelines. With over 1.5 million cases around the world, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the downsides of an integrated global economy. This has fanned fears of foreigners and provided legitimacy for clamping down on free trade and the movement of people. Two aspects, two components that are crucial to the idea of globalization. To discuss how this crisis may alter the future of free trade, today we have with us Mr. Mark Linscott. Mr. Linscott is the former Assistant US Trade Representative for South and Central Asia and WTO and Multilateral Affairs. He is currently a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a Senior Advisor at the Asia Group. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Thank you, Kashish. I think this is a fantastic initiative, and it's always great to work with ORF.
Okay, so let's begin with our conversation. The Office of the US Trade Representative recently announced that it's going to exempt certain imports from China, such as ventilators, nebulizers, oxygen masks, from its Section 301 action on China. Given your experience at the USTR office, what impact do you think this crisis will have on this consensus that seemed to be building under Trump on the US acting against Chinese unfair trade practices?
Well, I think it's safe to say that there continues to be a strong shared sense in favor of addressing these kinds of practices. They've had global economic impacts. They've affected many countries, and we're talking about subsidies being conveyed by state-owned enterprises, forced tech transfer, theft of intellectual property rights. But these are fundamental reforms, and they are part of a phase 2 negotiation. And I think it's likely that those negotiations have been suspended for the moment. At least delayed given preoccupations with COVID-19. Now there is the phase 1 agreement that's already in place, and that's being implemented. Both countries, the United States and China, seem satisfied with its implementation. China's been ramping up purchases of agricultural products, energy products. But for the moment, I think fundamental issues are on hold.
Right.
It's unlikely that they will resume those negotiations in a serious way. Also, there's been a trilateral process, United States, Japan, and the European Union on these issues. I think that's likely to be delayed as well. Additionally, though, I would note that I think it's unlikely that the United States is going to take more provocative actions. I wouldn't expect new shots across the bow. The one exception to that might be deployment of 5G and in particular the role of Huawei.
Okay. All right. So let's take a step back. Do you think this crisis will serve as a shot in the arm for anti-globalization forces? And since it's an election year in the US, how do you see this crisis figuring in Trump's messaging for 2020?
Well, I hate to say that it's a shot in the arm. It certainly inspires nativist instincts and can reinforce nationalistic trends in trade policies. And this has already been going on for some time. We've got 3 years of the Trump administration. We've got the experiences of tariffs being raised and the guise of national security on steel and aluminum applying to most countries. We've got the China dispute, the trade war there under Section 301 and tariffs having been applied across nearly all exports from China into the United States in retaliation by China. With COVID-19, we have new export bans. Last count, more than 80 countries have applied export bans on crucial medical supplies. Some are beginning to apply bans on trade in agricultural products. So this is definitely a difficult time. The WTO has also reported that prospects for trade during this year look like it will drop by anywhere from 13% to 32%. 13% is in the range of what happened during the 2008 recession. 32%, I mean, goes back to the Great Depression. I mean, this is historical stuff. Once in a generation. In terms of the election, President Trump definitely is. I mean, the wartime president. He's likely to argue that his trade policies have been effective with respect to economic growth, but he's running into the headwinds now of a recession. Joe Biden is likely to argue that there's a need to avoid alienating close allies. In fact, a need to rebuild those relationships during this global crisis.
Okay. The spread of COVID-19 is largely being pinned on the free movement of people. But globally connected supply chains are also being identified as tacit carriers of the virus. Do you think that this securitization of supply chains will pose an existential threat to free trade? And how do we cope up with that once this is over?
Well, certainly individuals, human beings transmit the virus. We've been seeing that when they travel, when they get on cruise ships. We're seeing community transmission. I'm doubtful that physical shipments of goods are a real threat in terms of transmitting the virus. Shipments can be in transit for days and even weeks. They arrive in ports, they get processed, they get cleared through customs. It just seems unlikely that trade would be a serious risk. But certainly, human transition is clearly a problem.
Right. You mentioned WTO in your previous response. Let me try and connect that here. What role do you think organizations like the WTO can play in restoring global confidence in free trade in terms of, say, getting the messaging right, that movements of goods will not mean that a virus is being transmitted, essentially?
Well, I like to think that there's a critical role for the WTO in the long term. It's delivered for more than 70 years since World War II in terms of contributing to remarkable trade growth and economic growth, first under the GATT and over the last couple of decades under the WTO. And in the short term, it clearly has a role to play, sounding the signals in terms of the implications of export restrictions, monitoring those. That said, the WTO is confronting its own set of challenges. It's frankly at a bit of an existential moment. Its appellate body is effectively non-operational, and that's because the United States has blocked the appointment of new judges. It really hasn't found a way to negotiate new agreements, with only a few exceptions. And frankly, it's been a bit leaderless. Certainly, the U.S. has not been exerting a leadership role. I mean, President Trump has repeatedly questioned the value of the WTO. So I think the WTO will come through this changed. It's a seminal moment. I like to think that it will be changed for the better. I mean, this should focus minds, and there are likely to be a lot of changes across international organizations, and I think the WTO could come out of this in a good way.
Okay, so let's try and end this on an optimistic note, Mark.
Okay.
From the standpoint of global commerce, if you were to try and see a silver lining to this crisis, what would that be?
Well, there's certainly hard to see that there's any kind of silver lining here. I mean, there's lives have been upended. We are socially distancing. Some of us are quarantined. We're working from home, if at all. People are losing their lives. We've we've got export restrictions, we've got a global recession. I think the G20 has been rudderless. It really hasn't been providing direction, certainly on trade, like it did back in 2008. The only silver lining I would see, and this is in the parochial area of the WTO, is that the ministerial conference that was scheduled for June in Nur-Sultan, Kazakhstan, that's been canceled. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. These ministerial conferences, they take place every 2 to 3 years. There have been successes like Bali in 2013. That's when the Trade Facilitation Agreement was concluded. There have been huge failures like Seattle in 1999. The last one, 2017 in Buenos Aires, was a bit of a dud. I don't think the WTO was ready to come together and do some good things for this ministerial conference. And if it gets delayed into 2021, mid-2021 or end of 2021, I think there are opportunities for the membership to come together and try to resolve some pressing issues like fisheries subsidies. I mean, to put some important points on the board and effectively have a better opportunity to reform itself.
Right. I do hope some better sense prevails and some kind of a multilateral cooperation emerges. On that note, thank you so much for joining us, Mark. On behalf of ORF, we hope you and your loved ones are staying safe. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Kashish, and same to you. Take care.